Good evening, dear listeners. As the sun gently sinks beyond the horizon and the world quiets down, we invite you to find a cozy spot to settle in. Tonight, we embark on a soothing journey through a rather unexpected corner of history, the meticulous procedures surrounding Viking settlement, grain storage, inventory, and shift rotation schedules. This may seem like a dry subject at first, but as we delve deeper, you'll discover a rhythm and beauty in the routines of these ancient peoples, one that mirrors the gentle ebb and flow of the tides. Imagine, if you will, the soft rustle of the wind through the thatched roofs of Viking longhouses, the distant call of the sea, and the rhythmic sound of waves lapping against the shore. In this tranquil setting, the Vikings faced everyday challenges that required careful planning and organization, particularly when it came to storing their precious grain supplies. Tonight, we'll explore how these formidable seafarers, often celebrated for their fierce raids and explorations, also demonstrated an extraordinary level of diligence in managing their resources. We will begin by discussing the importance of grain storage in Viking society. Grain was fundamental not only as a food source, but also as a symbol of stability and prosperity. We will delve into the techniques they employed to ensure that this vital resource remains safe from pests and the elements, exploring the structures and methods they developed to maintain the quality of their grain. You may find yourself imagining the sweet, earthy scent of freshly harvested grain and the careful hands that work to preserve it. Next, we will transition into the fascinating world of inventory procedures. The Vikings had to keep track of their grain supplies methodically, ensuring that every bushel was accounted for, and that the community could sustain itself through the long, harsh winters. We'll uncover the systems they used, the tools at their disposal, and the communal spirit that surrounded this essential duty. As we discuss these practices, think of how they contributed to the rhythm of daily life, creating a sense of security and predictability amidst the unpredictability of nature. Finally, we will explore the shift rotation schedules that were put in place to manage grain storage and inventory checks. You might picture the diligent workers, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of lantern light, taking turns to ensure that everything was in order. We will reflect on the significance of teamwork, collaboration, and the careful planning that went into these schedules, and how they created a sense of unity within the Viking community. As we weave through these topics, allow your mind to drift, letting go of the day's worries and embracing the calming cadence of this historical narrative. Let the soothing sounds of our exploration carry you into a serene space, where knowledge meets tranquility, and where the past gently wraps around you like a warm blanket. So, dear listeners, prepare to relax and unwind as we journey into the rich tapestry of Viking grain storage practices. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the stories of our ancestors guide you towards a peaceful state of mind. In just a moment, we will begin our exploration, uncovering the quiet yet profound legacy of these industrious seafarers and their careful stewardship of resources. Breathe deeply, and let the adventure begin. The origins of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules can be traced back to the late 8th century, specifically around the year 793 CE, when the first recorded Viking raid occurred at Lindisfarne, England. This event marked the beginning of the Viking Age, during which Norse explorers, warriors, and traders expanded their influence across Europe, establishing settlements and engaging in agricultural practices. The establishment of these settlements necessitated the development of systematic approaches to grain storage and inventory management to ensure food security and efficient resource allocation. One of the earliest known Viking settlements was established in the region of Jutland, present-day Denmark, around 800 CE. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings constructed longhouses, which served as multifunctional spaces for living, cooking, and storage. These structures were typically built using timber frames, with thatched roofs made from local vegetation. Inside these longhouses, designated areas were allocated for grain storage, where crops such as barley, oats, and rye were kept in large wooden containers known as kvees, which were elevated off the ground to prevent moisture damage and pest infestations. By the mid-9th century, as Viking settlements expanded into areas such as the British Isles and the coastal regions of modern-day Norway and Sweden, administrative procedures regarding grain storage became more formalized. Historical records indicate that chieftains and local leaders, such as the notable figure Harold Fairhair, played a critical role in overseeing agricultural activities. These leaders implemented administrative procedures that included the establishment of grain storage quotas and the creation of written records to track the amount stored, which were maintained on wooden tablets or animal skins. The development of grain storage inventory procedures was further refined by the 10th century, particularly in settlements like Hedeby, located on the southern tip of the Jutland Peninsula. Hedeby was a bustling trade hub, where grain storage was vital for both domestic consumption and trade. The architecture of grain storage facilities in Hedeby included large granaries, constructed with thick wooden walls and elevated platforms to facilitate airflow and deter rodents. The granaries were often organized in clusters, with each cluster assigned to specific families or clans, promoting a community-based approach to grain inventory management. In terms of administrative procedures, the Vikings employed a rudimentary but effective system of inventory management. Each household was responsible for maintaining its own grain storage records, which included details on the types of grain stored, quantities, and dates of harvest. These records were likely communicated verbally during communal meetings or inscribed in runes on wooden tablets. The use of runes, a writing system developed by the Norse, facilitated the documentation of agricultural practices and grain inventories, contributing to the overall efficiency of settlement management. Daily routines within Viking settlements revolved around agricultural cycles and grain management. During the summer months, typically from late May to August, the focus was on planting and tending to crops. Harvesting usually commenced in late August and extended into September. After the harvest, grains were meticulously sorted and stored in designated granaries. The process of sorting involved separating the grain from chaff and debris, which was a labor-intensive task often performed by women and children. This sorting was essential for maintaining the quality of stored grains, as any contamination could lead to spoilage and loss of food resources. Following the harvest, a shift rotation schedule was established to ensure the ongoing maintenance of grain storage facilities. This system involved the division of labor among community members, with individuals assigned specific tasks related to grain storage, inventory management, and facility upkeep. For instance, one group might be responsible for inspecting granaries for signs of rodent activity, while another group focused on organizing the stored grain. The rotation of these tasks ensured that all members of the community were engaged in the process, fostering a sense of shared responsibility. By the early 11th century, with the consolidation of power among chieftains and the emergence of early kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Norway under King Olav Tryggvason, grain storage practices became increasingly standardized. The introduction of centralized inventory management systems led to the creation of larger communal granaries, where grain from multiple households was stored. These granaries served not only as storage facilities but also as a means of redistributing grain during times of scarcity or famine. Architecturally, these communal granaries were characterized by their larger scale and greater structural complexity. They typically featured reinforced wooden beams and elevated platforms to improve ventilation. Additionally, the granaries were often located in proximity to marketplaces, facilitating trade and the exchange of grain. Documentation from this period suggests that grain was traded not only locally but also with neighboring regions, highlighting the interconnectedness of Viking settlements and their reliance on grain storage as a key economic resource. The administrative procedures surrounding grain inventory management during this time period were formalized through the establishment of local councils, known as Thing, where community members gathered to discuss agricultural practices and resource allocation. These councils included representatives from various clans and families, ensuring that diverse perspectives were considered in decision-making processes. Grain storage quotas were established based on population size and agricultural yield, with penalties imposed on households that failed to meet their quotas. This system of accountability served to reinforce the importance of grain storage as a communal resource and the necessity of individual responsibility for the collective well-being. In terms of daily routines, the shift rotation schedule evolved to include designated periods for grain processing, storage inspections, and records maintenance. Each community member was assigned specific shifts according to a predetermined rotation, ensuring that all tasks associated with grain storage were completed efficiently. This system not only maximized productivity but also fostered a sense of structure and discipline within the settlement. As the Viking Age progressed into the late 11th century, the advent of Christianity began to influence various aspects of Norse culture, including agricultural practices and grain management. The establishment of monasteries, such as those at Glastonbury and Lindisfarne, introduced new agricultural techniques and methods of grain storage. Monastic communities, often well-organized and disciplined, implemented advanced inventory management practices that included meticulous record-keeping and the use of systematic inventory audits. These practices were gradually adopted by surrounding Viking settlements, leading to enhanced grain storage efficiency. The architectural design of granaries continued to evolve during this period, with an increased emphasis on fireproofing and pest deterrence. Innovations included the use of clay and stone in granary construction, which provided greater durability and protection against the elements. Furthermore, granaries were often built with sloped roofs to facilitate rainwater runoff, thereby reducing moisture accumulation within the storage areas. In terms of administrative procedures, the integration of monastic practices led to the standardization of grain inventory procedures across various Viking settlements. This included the implementation of written records maintained by appointed grain overseers, who were responsible for conducting regular inventory checks and ensuring compliance with established storage quotas. The overseers played a critical role in mediating disputes related to grain allocation and storage, thus reinforcing the importance of adherence to communal guidelines. Daily routines within Viking settlements during this period became increasingly influenced by monastic practices, with an emphasis on structured schedules for grain processing and storage. The shift rotation system was expanded to accommodate the growing population and increased agricultural output. Individuals were assigned specific roles, such as grain sorters, overseers, and record keepers, ensuring that each aspect of grain storage was managed efficiently. By the early 12th century, as Viking settlements transitioned into more established feudal systems, the significance of grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules became firmly entrenched in the agricultural practices of the region. The continued emphasis on communal grain storage, accompanied by formalized administrative practices, played a crucial role in shaping the agricultural landscape of Scandinavia and the British Isles. In conclusion, the historical account of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules reveals a complex interplay of architectural design, administrative practices, and daily routines that evolved over several centuries. From the early longhouses of Jutland to the centralized granaries of the 11th century, the development of grain storage practices was instrumental in ensuring food security and fostering community cohesion among Viking settlements. The introduction of monastic influences and the subsequent standardization of grain inventory procedures further underscored the importance of efficient resource management in the evolving socio-economic landscape of the Viking Age. The legacy of these practices can be traced through the historical record, offering insights into the daily lives of Viking communities and their enduring reliance on agriculture as a cornerstone of their society. The construction methods employed in Viking grain storage facilities reflected both the utilitarian needs of agricultural societies and the geographical constraints of the regions they inhabited. The most prevalent type of grain storage was the stabber, a type of granary commonly found in Scandinavia. Typical dimensions of these structures ranged from 3 to 5 meters in height and 2 to 4 meters in width. The stabber was often constructed using a timber frame, with logs sourced from local coniferous trees such as pine and spruce, which were readily available in the northern woodlands. The walls were typically built using a technique known as wattle and daub, where woven branches were plastered with a mixture of clay and straw, providing both insulation and protection against pests. To enhance the longevity of these structures, the lower sections were often raised on stilts, constructed from durable wood or stone, which prevented moisture from the ground from affecting the grain stored within. The floors were generally made from wooden planks, with designs that allowed for natural ventilation to mitigate the risk of mold and spoilage, a crucial consideration given the humid climate of the Nordic regions. Roofs were typically steeply pitched, constructed with overlapping wooden shingles or thatched with straw, designed to facilitate the rapid runoff of rain and snow. Maintenance procedures for grain storage facilities were critical to ensuring the preservation of stored grains. Regular inspections were mandated. Historical records from as early as 900 CE indicate that these inspections occurred biannually, typically at the onset of spring and autumn. During these inspections, the structural integrity of walls and roofs was assessed, and any signs of rot or pest infestation were addressed immediately. Historical texts from the 11th century suggest that communities often employed a rotation system for these inspections, assigning specific households the responsibility of maintaining the stabber. In addition to structural maintenance, the cleanliness of the storage area was paramount. Procedures dictated that at least once a year, usually during the harvest season, the stabber should be emptied, cleaned, and inspected thoroughly. Grains were sifted to remove any foreign materials or spoiled grains, which could otherwise contaminate the entire stock. This process was typically documented, with records indicating the types and quantities of grains stored, along with any that were lost to spoilage. Financial records related to grain storage were meticulously kept, as grain represented a significant portion of a Viking community's wealth. A study of the financial ledgers from the late 10th century reveals that costs associated with the construction and maintenance of grain storage facilities were often noted in the community's annual accounts. For instance, a stabber constructed in 980 CE in the vicinity of present-day Uppsala incurred costs amounting to approximately 50 silver pennies, a substantial investment for a typical Viking household. This expenditure included materials, labor, and the transportation of resources, often necessitating coordination among multiple households within the community. Further records indicate the ongoing costs associated with maintaining these structures. For example, in the year 1015, a village in the region of modern-day Norway recorded an expenditure of 10 silver pennies for repairs to a stabber's roof, necessitated by storm damage sustained during the winter months. Such expenditures were often shared among community members, reflecting the cooperative nature of Viking society. Personnel involved in the management of grain storage facilities were typically drawn from the local population and included a variety of roles with distinct job descriptions. The primary overseer, known as the grain steward, was responsible for the overall supervision of the grain storage process. This individual, often appointed by community consensus, would ensure that storage practices adhered to established guidelines and would report any issues to the larger assembly of community leaders. Additionally, the role of the grain gatherer was crucial during harvest time. This individual was tasked with collecting and transporting harvested grains to the stabber. It was common for the grain gatherer to be accompanied by several assistants, who would help in the loading and unloading processes. Historical documents from the late 9th century outline that the grain gatherer was expected to maintain a precise inventory of the quantities collected, often utilizing a rudimentary form of tallying, where notches were made on a stick to denote amounts. The responsibilities extended further to the grain inspector, a role that emerged during the 11th century as storage techniques evolved. This position involved conducting quality assessments of stored grains, ensuring that the community's food supply remained uncontaminated. Inspections were often conducted prior to major community events, such as feasts or trade fairs, when grain would be distributed or sold. Technical specifications for grain storage facilities were governed by practical considerations rooted in the climatic conditions of the Nordic regions. The average humidity levels in these areas necessitated the design of storage units that allowed for adequate airflow while simultaneously protecting against moisture ingress. Historical records outline that stabber were often equipped with small vents at the base of the walls, measuring approximately 10 centimeters in height and 15 centimeters in width, to facilitate air circulation. Moreover, the dimensions of the grain storage facilities were often dictated by the types of grains stored. For instance, barley and oats required different storage conditions than rye, which was a staple in Viking diets. As such, stabber were often constructed in varying sizes to accommodate the specific needs of the grain type. The typical capacity for a stabber designed for barley storage was approximately 1,500 liters, while those designated for oats could hold up to 2,000 liters, reflecting the varying bulk densities of these grains. Additionally, the incorporation of pest deterrents was an essential aspect of technical design. Historical records indicate that certain stabber included compartments for storing traditional herbs such as wormwood and juniper, known for their pest-repelling properties. These compartments were typically located near the entrance of the storage facility, ensuring that the herb scent would permeate the grain storage area, thereby discouraging rodents and insects. In conclusion, the historical account of Viking grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules reveals a complex interplay of construction methodologies, maintenance protocols, financial stewardship, personnel organization, and technical specifications. The meticulous attention to detail in these practices underscores the centrality of agriculture and grain storage to the sustainability of Viking communities, providing a foundational aspect of their economy and social structure. Through a combination of communal effort, skilled labor, and adaptive techniques, Viking societies navigated the challenges of their environment, ensuring the preservation of their agricultural output and the continuity of their way of life. The Viking Age, typically delineated from approximately 793 AD to 1066 AD, is characterized not only by its maritime prowess and exploration but also by its meticulous approach to agricultural practices, particularly in relation to grain storage. This examination focuses on the construction methods and materials utilized for grain storage facilities, the ongoing maintenance procedures that supported their functionality, the financial records and costs associated with these operations, the personnel involved, and the technical specifications that govern storage procedures. Construction methods and materials. The construction of grain storage facilities, known as stabber, was a critical aspect of Viking agricultural infrastructure. These structures were primarily constructed from locally sourced timber, often pine or oak, which were abundant in Scandinavian forests. The stabber typically measured about 4 meters in width and 6 meters in length, rising to a height of approximately 3 meters. The use of a raised platform was common. This elevation, generally around 1 meter off the ground, was designed to prevent moisture from seeping into the grain and to deter vermin. Walls were constructed using a technique known as log cabin construction, where horizontal logs were stacked upon one another, notched at the ends to provide stability. This method, while labor-intensive, provided adequate insulation against the harsh Nordic winters. The roofs were typically thatched with straw or covered with wooden shingles, ensuring that rainwater could easily shed away from the structure. The interior of the stabber was often partitioned into sections using wooden frames, which allowed for the storage of different types of grains, such as barley, oats, and rye. Each section would be equipped with a ventilation system, typically small openings near the roof, to promote air circulation and reduce humidity levels, which were crucial for maintaining the integrity of the stored grain. Maintenance procedures. Maintenance of these storage facilities was essential for safeguarding the grains and ensuring their longevity. Regular inspections were conducted, typically at the change of seasons, to assess the structural integrity of the stabber. The inspections would focus on checking for signs of rot in wooden components, and any compromised sections were promptly replaced. In terms of pest control, Viking farmers employed various methods, including the use of traps made from wood and natural repellents such as herbs. The interior was cleaned periodically, often every 3 months, to ensure that no remnants of grain attracted pests or mold. It is documented that the introduction of cats to grain storage areas became common practice by the late 10th century, as these animals were particularly effective in controlling rodent populations. Additionally, the grain was rotated regularly. Each type of grain would be harvested and stored in a specific section of the stabber, but it was common practice to periodically transfer the oldest grain to the front for consumption, while new harvests were stored at the rear. This practice ensured that no grain was left to spoil and that the inventory was maintained in an orderly manner. Financial records and costs. The financial records pertaining to the construction and maintenance of grain storage facilities were meticulously documented by the Viking chieftains and their administrators. These records often included the costs associated with timber procurement, labor, and maintenance supplies. For instance, a stabber's construction in the year 970 AD is recorded to have required approximately 1,200 logs, each costing around 2 silver pennies, totaling 2,400 pennies solely for timber. Labor costs were similarly noted, with skilled carpenters earning 5 pennies per day, while unskilled laborers received 2 pennies. A typical stabber construction project could take about 20 days, resulting in a labor cost of approximately 100 pennies. Additionally, the upkeep costs of these facilities were recorded in ledgers that detailed expenditures on cleaning supplies, pest control measures, and any necessary repairs. A thorough audit in 1020 AD revealed that annual maintenance could range from 50 to 100 silver pennies, depending on the condition of the structure and the local climate. Personnel and job descriptions. The successful operation of grain storage facilities relied on a dedicated workforce. Key personnel included the grain steward, responsible for overseeing the inventory and ensuring that proper storage protocols were followed. This individual typically had a background in agriculture and was tasked with maintaining accurate records of grain quantities, types, and conditions. The grain steward was often supported by a small team of assistants, known as grain keepers, who were responsible for the day-to-day operations of the stabber. Grain keepers, typically young men or women from local farms, were tasked with regular inspections, cleaning, and the rotation of grain. They received training in recognizing signs of spoilage or pest infestation and were instructed on the proper methods of handling and storing different types of grain. The labor force also included carpenters who were responsible for the initial construction and subsequent repairs of the stabber. Their roles extended beyond mere construction, as they were also involved in the design and improvement of storage techniques based on observed issues and challenges encountered over the years. Effective communication was vital among these personnel, and regular meetings, often held during the winter months when agricultural activity was minimal, allowed for discussions regarding inventory levels, maintenance needs, and upcoming harvests. Technical specifications. The technical specifications governing grain storage were influenced by a variety of factors, including climate, type of grain, and local pests. For instance, the optimal humidity level for storing barley was generally between 12 to 14%, whereas oats required slightly lower humidity levels of around 10 to 12%. These specifications dictated both the design of the stabber and the methods employed in grain processing and storage. Temperature control was another critical aspect, as grain was best stored at temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius. In the Nordic regions, this was achievable during the winter months, allowing for the preservation of grains until they were needed for consumption or trade. Thus, the orientation of the stabber was often strategically planned to maximize shade during the summer months while maintaining adequate sunlight during the winter. Furthermore, Viking societies employed a variety of storage containers within the stabber, such as wooden barrels and woven baskets, which were crafted to specific dimensions. A typical storage barrel might have a diameter of 80 centimeters and a height of 1 meter, capable of holding approximately 200 liters of grain, thus facilitating easier handling and transport. In summary, the Viking approach to grain storage was marked by careful consideration of construction methods, maintenance practices, financial management, workforce organization, and technical specifications. Each element played a crucial role in ensuring the efficiency and effectiveness of their agricultural systems, thereby supporting the broader economic and social structures of Viking society. The construction methods employed in Viking settlement grain storage facilities were characterized by their adherence to utilitarian principles, reflecting the pragmatic nature of Viking society. The structures, often referred to as stabber, were primarily built using locally sourced materials, including timber, stone, and thatch. The choice of timber, predominantly derived from coniferous trees such as spruce, Picea abies, and pine, Pinus sylvestris, was favored due to its availability and structural properties. The logs were typically hewn using axes, which were standard-issue tools among Vikings as early as the 8th century AD. The walls of the stabber were constructed using a post and beam technique, a method that involves setting vertical posts into the ground and connecting them with horizontal beams. This method provided a sturdy framework capable of withstanding the harsh Scandinavian climate. The floor, often elevated above ground level, was constructed using planks or packed earth to prevent moisture from permeating the storage area. The elevation also facilitated airflow, which was critical for preserving grain quality. Roofs were traditionally thatched with reeds or straw, providing insulation while allowing for the escape of moisture. The maintenance of these grain storage facilities was essential for ensuring the longevity and effectiveness of the structures. Routine inspections were conducted at least biannually, typically during the spring and autumn months, to assess the integrity of the wood and check for signs of rot or pest infestation. Maintenance procedures included the application of a protective coating of animal fat or resin to the wooden surfaces, which was known to deter insects and prevent decay. Repair work, when necessary, involved the replacement of rotting timber, which could be executed swiftly, often within a week, depending on the severity of the damage. Financial records related to grain storage were meticulously kept and were crucial for the overall economic stability of Viking settlements. The system of accounting employed by the Vikings can be traced back to the late 8th century, with evidence of ledger-like records found in archaeological sites. Each stabber was assigned a unique identifier, allowing for the documentation of grain quantities, types, and associated costs. It was common practice to record transactions in runes on wooden sticks or on scraps of animal hide, with a typical entry noting the date, the quantity of grain stored or released, and the name of the individual responsible for the transaction. For instance, an entry dated July 14, 873 AD, might read, 50 bushels of barley received from the field of Bjorn, overseen by Eric, followed by a tally of costs associated with transportation and labor. The cost of grain storage was generally calculated based on the volume of grain, measured in bushels, with standard rates established by community consensus. On average, the cost of storing 1 bushel of grain for a season, approximately 6 months, was around 2 silver coins, reflecting the labor and resource investment required for maintenance and protection against spoilage. Personnel involved in grain storage operations were categorized into specific roles, each with distinct responsibilities. The primary overseer, known as the cornherd, held authority over all activities related to grain management. This individual was typically an experienced farmer, often selected for their knowledge of agricultural practices and inventory management. The cornherd was responsible for maintaining accurate records, overseeing the storage facilities, and ensuring that the grain was stored in optimal conditions. Beneath the cornherd were several other roles, including the grain gatherers, who were tasked with the collection and transport of harvested grain from the fields to the stabber. This group often consisted of younger members of the community, typically aged between 15 and 25, whose physical strength was deemed advantageous for the labor-intensive task of carrying heavy sacks of grain. Their job description also included cleaning and preparing the storage area before new grain was added, with specific guidelines dictating that cleaning should occur at least once before each harvest. Additionally, there were grain monitors, whose role involved periodic inspections of the stored grain. These monitors were responsible for checking for signs of spoilage, such as mold or infestation by pests like weevils. They were required to conduct these inspections at least once per month, recording any anomalies in the grain inventory log. If spoilage was detected, the grain monitors were instructed to segregate affected batches and report their findings to the cornherd immediately. The technical specifications of the stabber were largely determined by the volume of grain it was expected to house. A standard stabber was approximately 20 feet in length, 10 feet in width, and 12 feet in height, providing a total storage capacity of roughly 2,000 bushels of grain. Ventilation was a critical aspect of the design, necessitating the inclusion of strategically placed vents along the upper sections of the walls to promote airflow while preventing rain from entering. These vents were often covered with a fine mesh made from animal sinew to deter rodents. In terms of grain storage techniques, it was common to employ a stratified approach, where different types of grains were stored separately to minimize the risk of cross-contamination and spoilage. Barley, oats, and rye were the most commonly stored grains, each requiring specific storage conditions. Barley, for instance, was ideally stored at a temperature below 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, to prevent germination, while oats were more resilient and could tolerate slightly higher temperatures. The shift rotation schedule for personnel working in grain storage was designed to optimize labor efficiency while ensuring that all aspects of grain management were adequately addressed. A typical schedule might involve 3 shifts per day, each lasting approximately 8 hours. The first shift began at dawn, around 5 a.m., and was primarily focused on incoming grain collection and storage preparation. The second shift started at 1 p.m., concentrating on inspections and maintenance of the storage facilities, while the final shift commenced at 9 p.m., dedicated to monitoring grain quality and performing inventory checks. To further ensure efficiency, personnel often rotated through different roles on a bi-weekly basis, allowing them to gain experience and knowledge across various aspects of grain storage operations. This practice not only fostered a sense of community and teamwork but also mitigated the risks associated with having specialized roles that could become vulnerable to individual absences. In conclusion, the meticulous nature of Viking grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules reflects the broader economic and social structures of their society. With a focus on practicality and efficiency, the construction methods, maintenance procedures, financial records, personnel roles, and technical specifications all contributed to a robust system that enabled the Vikings to thrive in their agricultural endeavors. The attention to detail in each aspect of grain storage management underscores the significant role that these practices played in sustaining the community and ensuring food security throughout the Viking Age. The construction methods and materials utilized in Viking grain storage facilities were dictated by the environmental conditions of the regions they inhabited, alongside the available resources and prevailing technologies of the time. The primary materials employed in the construction of granaries, or hus, included timber, which was often sourced from local forests. The preferred species were typically oak, Quercus robur, and pine, Pinus sylvestris, selected for their durability and resistance to decay. The dimensions of these structures varied, but a common size for a granary was approximately 5 meters in width, 7 meters in length, and 3 meters in height. This provided enough space to store an estimated 10 to 15 metric tons of grain. The construction process began with the selection of an appropriate site, ideally elevated to prevent water accumulation and flooding. The foundation was often constructed using large stones, which were available in ample supply along riverbanks and coastal areas. These stones not only provided stability but also aided in keeping the grain dry and protected from vermin. The superstructure was typically built using a post and beam method, where vertical posts were positioned in the ground and horizontal beams were affixed to create a frame. Thatching, made from reeds or straw, was commonly used for roofing, providing insulation and waterproofing. Maintenance procedures for these grain storage facilities were crucial for ensuring the longevity of the structures and the quality of the grain stored within. Regular inspections were scheduled biannually, typically in early spring and late autumn, to assess the integrity of the roof and walls. Any signs of rot or insect infestation were addressed promptly to prevent further deterioration. The recommended maintenance tasks included the replacement of damaged thatch, reinforcement of weakened beams, and the application of tar or pitch to protect wooden elements from moisture. Financial records related to the construction and maintenance of grain storage facilities provide insight into the economic considerations of Viking communities. The costs associated with building a granary in the late 9th century could range from 100 to 200 silver coins, depending on the scale and complexity of the structure. Labor costs were significant, as skilled craftsmen were often required for construction. It is estimated that a skilled carpenter could earn approximately 1 silver coin per day, while laborers received about half of that for their efforts. Thus, the financial outlay for construction included not only materials but also labor, which accounted for roughly 60% of total expenses. The documentation of these financial transactions was imperative for the effective management of resources. Record-keeping methods varied, but many Viking communities utilized runestones or wooden tablets inscribed with runes to maintain inventories and account for expenditures. Such records often included detailed entries of grain purchases, sales, and losses due to spoilage or pest damage. It is noted that during the period of 850 to 950 CE, one such community in Norway recorded grain losses of approximately 3% annually, prompting adjustments in storage practices and inventory management. Personnel involved in the operation of grain storage facilities had clearly defined job descriptions, essential for the efficient functioning of the granary. The chief grain overseer, often referred to as the cornesteerer, was responsible for the overall management of grain storage, including the allocation of resources, supervision of staff, and maintenance of records. This individual typically had a background in agriculture or trade, with previous experience managing similar facilities. The cornesteerer was supported by a team of assistants, including grain clerks, who were tasked with maintaining accurate inventory records, and laborers responsible for the physical handling of grain. The shift rotation schedules for laborers were meticulously planned to ensure that the grain was regularly inspected and maintained. Work shifts were organized into a 5-day rotation, with laborers working 10-hour shifts from dawn until dusk. Each day was divided into 2 shifts, allowing for adequate rest periods. The first shift commenced at sunrise, approximately 6 a.m., and concluded at noon, followed by a second shift that resumed at 1 p.m. and ended at sunset, around 8 p.m. This rotation not only ensured continuous oversight of the grain storage but also allowed for the redistribution of labor across different tasks, such as cleaning, loading, and transportation of grain. Technical specifications for grain storage facilities were guided by both practical considerations and the desire for efficiency. The design of the granary often included features such as ventilation openings to allow for airflow, which was essential in preventing moisture buildup and the consequent spoilage of grain. These openings, typically located near the roof, measured about 30 centimeters in width and were covered with a fine mesh to prevent rodents from accessing the stored grain. The floor of the granary was typically raised above ground level, often constructed from wooden planks or stones, creating a space of approximately 30 centimeters between the stored grain and the ground. This elevation served to deter pests and moisture intrusion. In addition to these structural elements, the Viking granaries were often equipped with simple measuring devices for grain inventory management. Grain measures, known as cornmeal, were standardized containers made from wood, with a typical capacity of 20 liters. These measures were essential for both inventory tracking and trade, as they provided a reliable means of quantifying the volume of grain being stored or sold. Records indicate that variations in grain quality, such as the presence of chaff or contaminants, could lead to adjustments in the volume of grain recorded, necessitating careful observation and documentation. Further refinements in grain storage practices during the Viking Age can be traced to evolving agricultural techniques and climatic conditions. For instance, during the warmer periods of the medieval warm period, approximately 950 to 1250 CE, grain yields increased, prompting communities to expand their storage capacities. This led to the emergence of larger granaries, some exceeding dimensions of 10 meters in width and 15 meters in length, capable of storing upwards of 30 metric tons of grain. The expansion necessitated a re-evaluation of maintenance and labor allocation, resulting in the hiring of additional personnel during peak harvest seasons. The establishment of trade routes during the Viking Age also impacted grain storage inventory procedures. As communities engaged in trade with regions as far as Byzantium and the Middle East, the exchange of grains such as barley, oats, and rye became commonplace. The integration of foreign grain varieties prompted Viking communities to adapt their storage methods, leading to the implementation of mixed storage practices. This involved the separation of different grain types within the same facility, often using partitioned sections within the granary, each tailored to the specific needs of the grain stored. In conclusion, the intricate details surrounding the construction, maintenance, financial management, personnel structuring, and technical specifications of Viking grain storage facilities reveal a deeply organized approach to resource management that was critical for sustaining the communities during the Viking Age. The meticulous attention to detail in these operations underscores the importance of grain storage not only as a means of food security but as a foundation for the economic stability of Viking society. The legacy of these practices, though seemingly mundane, laid the groundwork for future advancements in agricultural storage and management techniques, influencing generations to come. ###The tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules. Part 6, Regional Variations and Comparisons. In the vast expanse of the Viking settlements, which spanned from the fjords of Norway to the verdant pastures of England, regional variations in grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules emerged, dictated by local climatic conditions, agricultural practices, and socio-political structures. For instance, in the fertile valleys of the river Seine, the abundance of grain led to a denser and more complex inventory system compared to the more austere procedures found in the rugged terrains of Iceland. In the former, settlements often utilized large communal granaries, constructed with timber and reinforced with local stone, which not only stored grain but also served as social hubs for trade and community gatherings. The meticulous inventory records of these granaries were maintained by appointed officials known as grain stewards, who were responsible for ensuring that supplies met the demands of the local populace. These stewards adhered to a standardized inventory system that included detailed logs of grain types, quantities, and distribution schedules, often utilizing a system of tally sticks for record keeping. Conversely, in Iceland, where the harsh climatic conditions limited agricultural output, grain storage was often a more solitary endeavor. Each household operated its own granary, typically constructed from turf and earth, with minimal oversight from any governing body. The inventory procedures were less formalized. Families maintained their records in the form of simple notches carved into wooden sticks or through oral traditions passed down through generations. Shift rotations in these contexts were often dictated by familial ties and seasonal labor availability, reflecting a more ad hoc approach compared to the regimented schedules found in more populous regions. Part 7, Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules can be traced across several distinct phases, reflecting broader socio-economic transformations within Viking society. Initially, during the early Viking Age, circa 793 to 850 AD, grain storage systems were rudimentary, characterized by simple earthen pits where harvested grains were stored to protect them from moisture and pests. These pits, often located near the family homestead, required minimal oversight and allowed for immediate access. As Viking society transitioned into the High Middle Ages, circa 850–1100 AD, the complexity of grain storage procedures began to increase. The establishment of larger settlements and the growth of trade networks necessitated more sophisticated inventory systems. Granaries began to evolve from simple pits to elevated wooden structures, designed to promote air circulation and reduce spoilage. This shift was accompanied by the introduction of more formalized shift rotation schedules, as labor became increasingly specialized. The role of the grain steward became more prominent, with these individuals often undergoing training to manage the growing complexities of grain inventory. By the late medieval period, circa 1100 to 1500 AD, the bureaucratic nature of grain storage and distribution systems had become firmly entrenched within Viking settlements. Towns such as Ribe and Hedeby became centers of trade and commerce, leading to the professionalization of grain management roles. Detailed documentation practices emerged, with grain inventories being meticulously recorded in ledger books, often accompanied by detailed annotations regarding the quality of the grain, storage conditions, and even the seasonal fluctuations in grain yield. Part 8, Bureaucratic Regulations and Laws. The increasing complexity of grain storage systems led to the establishment of a framework of bureaucratic regulations and laws that governed grain management practices across Viking settlements. These regulations were often codified in local laws known as grain decrees, which outlined the responsibilities of grain stewards, the standards for grain quality, and the penalties for mismanagement. One of the most notable regulations was the Grain Quality Mandate, which specified the acceptable moisture content for stored grains. Failure to adhere to these standards could result in severe penalties, including fines or the forfeiture of grain. The measurement of moisture content was achieved through rudimentary methods, such as the hand test, where an individual would grasp a handful of grain to assess its dryness or dampness. Additionally, the establishment of grain storage cooperatives necessitated further bureaucratic oversight, leading to the formation of councils comprised of local leaders and grain stewards. These councils were responsible for ensuring compliance with grain regulations, mediating disputes between grain producers and consumers, and overseeing the equitable distribution of grain during times of scarcity. Part 9, Supply Chain and Logistics. The supply chain and logistics of grain storage during the Viking Age were intricately linked to both agricultural practices and trade networks. The grain supply chain began with the cultivation of crops, primarily barley and rye, which were sown in spring and harvested in late summer. The grains were then transported to communal granaries or individual households, often using sledges or boats, depending on the geography of the region. Once the grain was stored, the logistics of distribution became paramount, especially in larger settlements where demand often fluctuated based on seasonal cycles and population density. Granaries maintained a careful balance of inventory, employing a system of FIFO, first in, first out, to ensure older grain was utilized before newer crops. This method was crucial in preventing spoilage and maintaining the overall quality of the stored grain. During times of surplus, grain was often traded with neighboring settlements, creating a network of exchange that was vital to the economic stability of Viking communities. This inter-settlement trade required careful logistical planning, as the transportation of grain over long distances posed challenges related to spoilage and pest infestation. As a response, traders developed protective measures, such as the use of tarred barrels for grain storage during transport, which significantly extended the shelf life of the products. Part 10, Record-Keeping Methods. The methods of record-keeping for grain storage inventory were as varied as the regions themselves, ranging from oral traditions to the use of written records. In the earliest Viking settlements, record-keeping was largely informal, relying on the collective memory of community members. However, as the complexity of grain management increased, so too did the sophistication of record-keeping methods. The introduction of writing systems, particularly the runic alphabet, played a significant role in enhancing record-keeping practices. Grain stewards began to document inventory levels, distribution schedules, and quality assessments in rune-inscribed tablets, which served as both practical records and symbolic representations of authority. These tablets were often stored in the granaries themselves, ensuring that records were readily accessible. In addition to runic inscriptions, the Vikings also employed a variety of physical tools for record-keeping, including tally sticks and notched bones. These objects served as mnemonic devices, allowing grain stewards to track inventory levels and shifts without the need for written documentation. The use of tally sticks, in particular, was widespread, with each notch representing a specific quantity of grain. This method allowed for quick visual assessments of inventory, particularly useful during peak harvest seasons when rapid decision-making was essential. As the Viking Age progressed into the medieval period, the advent of parchment and ink allowed for more formalized record-keeping. Ledger books became commonplace in larger settlements, enabling grain stewards to maintain comprehensive records of grain inventories, shifts, and transactions. These books often included detailed annotations regarding the origin of the grain, the conditions of storage, and any notable events that may have affected supply, such as droughts or conflicts. In conclusion, the history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a rich tapestry woven from the threads of regional variations, evolving practices, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and record-keeping methods. Each facet of this history, while seemingly mundane, contributes to a broader understanding of Viking society and its intricate relationship with the agricultural systems that sustained it. The evolution of these practices reflects not only the practical necessities of grain management but also the cultural and social dynamics that shaped the lives of those who navigated this complex landscape. The history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a multifaceted tapestry, interwoven with regional variations and comparisons that are as diverse as the geographical expanses they inhabited. This in-depth exploration seeks to elucidate the complexities of these procedures, particularly in relation to the regional characteristics of Viking settlements, the evolution of practices over various time periods, the bureaucratic regulations that govern them, the intricate supply chain and logistics involved, and the record-keeping methods that were employed to maintain a semblance of order amidst the agricultural chaos that often characterized Viking life. ### Regional variations and comparisons. The Viking Age, approximately spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, witnessed the establishment of settlements across a vast territory, from the fjords of Norway to the rolling plains of England and the islands of the North Atlantic. Each of these regions possessed its own unique climatic and geographical conditions, which invariably influenced grain storage practices. For instance, the coastal settlements in Scandinavia, which were often subject to high humidity and saltwater exposure, required grain storage facilities to be constructed with materials that mitigated moisture-related damage. Thus, the use of wooden silos reinforced with local stone became prevalent. In contrast, the drier inland regions favored subterranean grain pits, whose earthen construction provided natural insulation against temperature fluctuations. In the British Isles, Viking settlers adapted their grain storage techniques to align with local agricultural practices. The introduction of the staddle stone, a raised platform with a conical stone base, was a notable adaptation that helped protect grain from vermin, a significant concern given the local rodent population. Similarly, the incorporation of thatched roofing on granaries in Ireland reflected a fusion of local architectural styles with Viking sensibilities, illustrating how Viking settlers were not merely imposing their practices but also assimilating into the existing frameworks of the regions they occupied. Comparative studies of Viking grain storage methods reveal significant insights into socioeconomic structures as well. In regions where agriculture was supplemented by extensive raiding and trading activities, such as in parts of England and Ireland, grain storage facilities tended to be larger, reflecting a surplus that was often exchanged for goods or services. Conversely, in more isolated settlements, where self-sufficiency was paramount, grain storage was more modest, serving primarily to meet local needs. #evolution over different time periods. The evolution of grain storage practices throughout the Viking Age can be dissected into distinct phases, each corresponding to shifts in socio-economic conditions, technological advancements, and cultural influences. During the early Viking Age, grain storage was relatively rudimentary, characterized by the use of simple wooden structures and natural pits. Evidence from archaeological sites indicates that early granaries were often built upon elevated ground to avoid flooding and were typically constructed with minimal ventilation, leading to challenges in maintaining grain quality. As the Viking Age progressed, particularly during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, a discernible shift occurred towards more sophisticated storage solutions. This period saw the emergence of purpose-built granaries with improved ventilation systems, designed to reduce moisture accumulation and prevent spoilage. The introduction of smaller, portable storage containers, such as baskets woven from reeds, allowed for the easier transport of grain to and from larger storage facilities, facilitating a more dynamic approach to grain management. The gradual militarization of Viking society, alongside increased trade networks, further influenced grain storage practices. The need for secure storage solutions became paramount, particularly in settlements that served as trading hubs. Granaries began to incorporate fortified features, such as thick walls and reinforced doors, reflecting a growing concern for the protection of valuable food resources against both rival factions and opportunistic marauders. This evolution was not merely functional but also symbolic, representing a shift in the perception of grain as a commodity that could be hoarded, traded, or defended. #Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic landscape surrounding Viking grain storage was complex and varied significantly across different regions and time periods. The establishment of local laws and regulations governing grain storage often stemmed from communal needs, as the effective management of grain supplies was essential for the survival of the community, particularly during harsh winters or poor harvests. In some settlements, local chieftains, or assemblies enacted regulations that dictated the maximum allowable storage for individual households, aiming to prevent hoarding and ensure equitable distribution of resources during times of scarcity. Moreover, the legal framework surrounding grain storage extended to the maintenance of granaries and the responsibilities of those tasked with their upkeep. For example, it was not uncommon for local laws to prescribe penalties for neglect or mismanagement of grain stores, thereby instilling a sense of accountability among community members. These regulations were often inscribed on wooden tablets or stone monuments, which served as both a practical guide and a reminder of civic duty. The influence of Christianity in the later Viking Age also precipitated changes in bureaucratic oversight of grain storage practices. With the establishment of monasteries, which often served as centers of agricultural innovation and grain management, new regulations emerged that emphasized not only efficiency but also the moral implications of food distribution. The monastic approach to grain storage often included provisions for the needy, reflecting a growing awareness of social responsibility that transcended mere economic considerations. ####Supply chain and logistics. The intricacies of the Viking grain supply chain and logistics are deserving of meticulous examination. At the core of this logistical framework was the relationship between producers, storage facilities, and consumers, which necessitated a well-coordinated system of inventory management. Farmers were often responsible for delivering their harvested grain to central storage facilities, which served as communal hubs for grain distribution. The establishment of designated routes for transportation, often along rivers or coastal paths, was crucial for ensuring timely deliveries, particularly during the peak harvest season. The use of pack animals, primarily horses and oxen, played a pivotal role in the logistics of grain transport. The capacity of these animals dictated the volume of grain that could be moved at any given time, necessitating a careful balancing act between storage and transport capabilities. Furthermore, the decision to utilize watercraft for grain transportation along inland waterways and coastal routes provided an additional layer of efficiency, enabling larger quantities of grain to be moved more swiftly than overland routes. Seasonal variations also influenced the logistics of grain supply chains. During harvest time, the influx of grain necessitated meticulous planning to prevent storage facilities from becoming overwhelmed. This often led to the establishment of temporary storage structures, such as granary tents, which could be erected in fields and rapidly disassembled post-harvest. The dynamic nature of this logistical framework underscores the adaptability of Viking communities in responding to the cyclical demands of agricultural life. ###Record-keeping methods. The importance of accurate record-keeping in the realm of grain storage cannot be overstated. Despite the relatively rudimentary nature of Viking writing systems, various methods were employed to track grain inventory and management practices. The use of tally sticks, wooden sticks with notches cut into them, was a common practice for recording quantities of grain stored or distributed. This method allowed for quick visual assessments of inventory levels and facilitated straightforward communication among those responsible for grain management. In addition to tally sticks, the advent of runic inscriptions on stones or wooden tablets marked a significant advancement in the documentation of grain-related transactions. These inscriptions often included details concerning the quantity of grain stored, the date of storage, and the names of individuals responsible for the grain. Such records served not only as practical tools for inventory management but also as historical artifacts that provide insight into the socio-economic realities of Viking life. Moreover, communal grain storage facilities often employed a system of colored markers or painted symbols to indicate the ownership of stored grain. This visual record-keeping method allowed for quick identification of grain belonging to specific households, thus reducing disputes over ownership and facilitating smoother distribution processes. In conclusion, The History of Viking Settlement Grain Storage Inventory Procedures and Shift Rotation Schedules is a rich and complex narrative that encompasses a myriad of regional variations, evolutions over time, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and record-keeping methods. Each of these facets contributes to a deeper understanding of Viking society, illuminating not only the practical aspects of grain management but also the underlying social dynamics that shaped their communities. Through this exploration, we gain a greater appreciation for the mundane yet essential procedures that sustained Viking life and enabled their remarkable expansion across vast territories. The Tedious History of Viking Settlement Grain Storage Inventory Procedures and Shift Rotation Schedules, Part 8. In the broader context of the Viking Age, which spanned from approximately 793 to 1066 CE, the procedures surrounding grain storage inventory and shift rotations varied remarkably across the various regions inhabited by these seafaring Scandinavians. The diversity in settlement structures, climatic conditions, and agricultural practices contributed to notable regional variations in how grain was managed. This segment will delve into these regional nuances, explore the evolution of grain storage and shift rotation from the early Viking period to the late Middle Ages, discuss the bureaucratic regulations that shaped these practices, examine the intricacies of supply chain and logistics, and scrutinize the methods employed for record-keeping in Viking settlements. Regional variations and comparisons. Geographically, Viking settlements can be broadly categorized into three regions: Scandinavia, comprising modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the British Isles, and parts of continental Europe including Normandy and the eastern Baltic territories. Each of these regions exhibited distinct approaches to grain storage and the management thereof, influenced by local agricultural outputs, climate, and cultural practices. In Scandinavia, the harsh climate necessitated the development of robust grain storage techniques. The cold and often wet conditions required that grain be stored in elevated structures to prevent spoilage due to moisture. Elevated granaries, often constructed from timber with elevated platforms, were prevalent. The use of wooden structures not only provided a barrier against rodents but also allowed for better air circulation, which was crucial in preventing the growth of mold. The grain would be stored in woven baskets made from reeds or rushes, a practice that was both practical and resource efficient. Conversely, in the British Isles, particularly in areas such as East Anglia, where the climate was milder and the soil more fertile, the approach to grain storage was somewhat less rigorous. Here, Viking settlers adopted local practices, which included the construction of earth-covered granaries. These structures typically featured a thatched roof and were partially sunken into the ground to maintain a stable temperature and humidity level. The use of clay or mud in construction further contributed to the granaries' insulation properties, making them suitable for the storage of barley and wheat. In the eastern Baltic territories, where the cultural influence of Slavic communities was strong, the Viking approach to grain storage was influenced by local customs. Here, communal granaries were common, reflecting a collective approach to grain management. These granaries were larger and designed to accommodate the harvests of multiple households. This communal system fostered cooperation among neighbors, as grain-sharing arrangements were often established, thereby providing a buffer against individual crop failures. The differences in grain storage techniques across regions were not merely practical, they were also emblematic of the social structures and agricultural philosophies that prevailed in each area. In Scandinavia, individualistic and family-centric approaches were the norm, whereas in the British Isles and Eastern Baltic, communal practices were more pronounced. Evolution over different time periods. The Viking Age witnessed significant evolution in the methods of grain storage and management from its inception to its conclusion. Early Viking settlements, around the late 8th century, relied heavily on rudimentary storage techniques, often utilizing simple wooden bins or underground pits. As the Viking society evolved, so too did their understanding of agricultural practices and storage technologies. By the 10th century, with the establishment of trade routes and increased interaction with other cultures, Viking settlers began to adopt more sophisticated methods. The introduction of new tools, such as iron sickles and grinding stones, enhanced agricultural efficiency, and as a result, grain yields improved. This increase necessitated the development of more robust storage solutions. Evidence from archaeological sites indicates that granaries began to incorporate features such as ventilation holes and raised floors, allowing for better air circulation and pest control. The late Viking period, particularly during the 11th century, saw a formalization of grain storage practices. With the establishment of more centralized forms of governance and the codification of laws, bureaucratic regulations began to dictate how grain inventories were managed. The need for systematic record-keeping became paramount, as grain was not only a staple food source but also a form of currency and a means of wealth accumulation. The increasing complexity of these systems reflected the broader changes occurring in Viking society, as it transitioned from a largely decentralized tribal structure to a more hierarchical and organized form of governance. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The transition towards bureaucratic oversight of grain storage and inventory management was marked by the emergence of legal codes that sought to standardize practices and ensure equitable distribution of resources. In the late 10th and 11th centuries, as Viking leaders consolidated power, they began to implement laws that outlined specific grain storage protocols. These regulations often included stipulations regarding the construction of granaries, the maintenance of inventories, and the rotation of grain supplies to prevent spoilage. One notable example is the laws of King Harald Fairhair in Norway, which mandated that farmers report their grain inventory to local authorities. This not only facilitated better resource management within the community but also enabled the king to levy taxes based on grain outputs. Such regulations often included penalties for mismanagement or failure to comply with inventory reporting, reinforcing the importance of diligent record-keeping. In addition to local laws, there were also broader regulatory frameworks established through alliances and treaties with neighboring cultures. The Danelaw in England, for instance, created a unique legal landscape where Viking settlers had to navigate both local Anglo-Saxon laws and their own customs. This required careful negotiation of grain storage practices, leading to a hybridization of methods that incorporated aspects of both cultures. Supply chain and logistics. The logistics of grain storage were intimately connected to the supply chain management practices of Viking settlements. The scale of grain production and storage varied significantly depending on the settlement size and location. Larger settlements, particularly those that served as trade hubs, necessitated more complex logistical frameworks to manage grain distribution effectively. In urban centers such as Hedeby and Burka, grain storage facilities were often strategically located near waterways for ease of transport. The use of boats for moving grain allowed for efficient trade and distribution, enabling settlements to exchange surplus grain with neighboring regions. This not only enhanced food security but also fostered a culture of interdependence among Viking settlements. The logistics of grain management also extended to labor practices, as the seasonal nature of agricultural work required strategic planning of labor shifts. During the harvest season, labor rotation schedules were meticulously crafted to ensure that sufficient manpower was available for both harvesting and subsequent storage tasks. This often involved intricate agreements among families and neighboring farms, as they would share labor resources to optimize efficiency. Record-keeping methods. The importance of record-keeping in the context of grain storage cannot be overstated. Viking societies developed various methods for tracking grain inventories, which were essential for both economic and social stability. While written records were not widely adopted until later periods, particularly with the influence of the Christian Church, early Vikings often relied on oral traditions and physical markers to keep track of grain supplies. One common method involved the use of tally sticks, which were notched pieces of wood that recorded quantities of grain. Each notch represented a specific measure, allowing for a straightforward visual representation of inventory levels. This method was particularly useful in communal granaries, where shared resources required transparency and accountability among users. In addition to tally sticks, some settlements utilized simple ledger systems inscribed on wooden tablets or stone. These records would often include information about grain types, quantities, and dates of storage and retrieval. The advent of Christianity in Viking territories also saw an increase in literacy, leading to more formalized record-keeping practices influenced by monastic traditions. As Viking society evolved and became more interconnected with the broader European landscape, the need for comprehensive record-keeping grew. By the late Middle Ages, with the establishment of more complex bureaucratic systems, detailed inventories became standard practice. These records not only documented grain supplies but also played a critical role in taxation and resource management, laying the groundwork for modern agricultural and economic practices. Conclusion. In conclusion, the history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules reveals a complex tapestry of regional variations, bureaucratic regulations, and logistical considerations that evolved over time. The practices surrounding grain management were not merely a reflection of agricultural needs but were intertwined with the social, economic, and political fabric of Viking society. From the rudimentary storage techniques of the early Viking Age to the increasingly sophisticated inventory systems of the late Middle Ages, these practices demonstrate the adaptability and resilience of Viking culture in the face of changing circumstances. The meticulous record-keeping methods that emerged over time highlight the importance of grain not only as a staple food source but also as a vital component of the Viking economy. Ultimately, the tedious history of grain storage and inventory management serves as a testament to the ingenuity and organizational skills of the Viking people, whose legacy continues to influence agricultural practices to this day. The tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules, Part 9. Regional variations and comparisons. The Viking Age, spanning approximately from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was characterized not only by its seafaring exploits but also by the diverse agricultural practices across the Scandinavian settlements. The variations in grain storage and inventory procedures were influenced by regional climates, soil fertility, and local customs. For instance, the fertile lands of the Götaland region in Sweden provided a bountiful harvest of barley and oats, leading to a more sophisticated grain storage infrastructure compared to the harsher terrains of northern Norway, where the short growing season limited both the types and quantities of grain harvested. In Götaland, the abundance of grain necessitated the establishment of larger communal granaries, known as cornis, which were built to accommodate the surplus. These granaries were often elevated on stilts to protect against moisture and pests, a practice that differed markedly from the more rudimentary storage methods employed in Norway, where grain was often stored in smaller, less elaborate structures. In contrast, the Norse settlements in Iceland, where agriculture was constrained by volcanic soil, relied heavily on a combination of imported grain and preserved foodstuffs, leading to unique inventory practices that emphasized the careful cataloging of limited resources. Moreover, the varying degrees of centralization in governance across Viking settlements influenced grain storage practices. In regions governed by strong chieftains, such as in parts of Denmark, inventory procedures were often formalized into bureaucratic systems. Conversely, in areas with less centralized authority, such as parts of Finland, grain storage could be a more communal and less regulated affair, with local customs prevailing over formal inventory methods. Evolution over different time periods. As we traverse the timeline of Viking settlements, it becomes evident that grain storage and inventory procedures evolved markedly. Initially, during the early Viking Age, circa 793 to 850 AD, the focus was primarily on survival, with rudimentary methods of storing grain, such as earthen pits and wooden containers, being predominant. These early practices were often dictated by immediate survival needs, with little attention paid to long-term inventory management. However, as Viking society became more organized and trade networks expanded, particularly after the establishment of trading hubs like Birka and Hedeby, the practices surrounding grain storage began to evolve. By the mid-Viking Age, circa 850 to 950 AD, there was a noticeable shift towards more systematic approaches to grain inventory. This period saw the advent of more durable storage facilities, often constructed from timber and featuring improved ventilation, which allowed for better preservation of grain. In the late Viking Age, circa 950–1066 AD, with the increasing influence of Christianity and the establishment of monasteries, regulations surrounding grain storage became more standardized. Monastic communities, which were often at the forefront of agricultural innovation, began to implement meticulous inventory procedures. The establishment of written records for grain storage became commonplace, reflecting a broader trend towards bureaucratic oversight in Viking society. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. As the Viking Age progressed, the regulation of grain storage and inventory practices began to reflect broader societal changes. The emergence of legal codes, such as the Laws of the Northmen, introduced structured guidelines that dictated how grain should be stored, inventoried, and managed. These laws emphasized the importance of maintaining accurate records, particularly in relation to communal grain stores, which were often the lifeblood of a settlement. One particularly noteworthy regulation was the grain law, which mandated that every household maintain a written inventory of their grain stores, including details such as the type of grain, quantity, and date of harvest. This law was instrumental in preventing misappropriation and ensuring that all members of the community had equitable access to stored grain. Furthermore, the grain law stipulated that a communal granary must be inspected at regular intervals by elected officials to ensure compliance with storage standards. The enforcement of these regulations often fell to local chieftains or community elders, who were tasked with conducting audits of grain inventories. These audits were not merely bureaucratic formalities, they served to reinforce community bonds and maintain trust among residents. In many settlements, these audits were conducted during the harvest festival, turning what could have been a tedious process into a communal celebration of abundance and cooperation. Supply chain and logistics. The logistics of grain storage were intricately tied to the larger supply chain within Viking settlements. The procurement of grain was not a standalone process, rather, it was woven into the fabric of agricultural production, trade, and seasonal cycles. The Vikings utilized a combination of subsistence farming and trade to ensure a steady supply of grain, which necessitated careful planning and coordination. Local farmers typically harvested their grain in late summer, and the timing of these harvests was critical. The onset of the harvest season dictated not only the storage practices but also the shift rotation schedules for those responsible for processing and storing the grain. In settlements where grain was processed into flour, dedicated milling shifts were organized to ensure that the grain was promptly ground and stored, minimizing spoilage. Trade routes also played a significant role in shaping grain logistics. The Vikings, known for their extensive trading networks, often exchanged surplus grain for other commodities such as furs, timber, and iron. This exchange required meticulous record-keeping to ensure that grain stores were replenished in accordance with trade agreements. As a result, the role of traders became increasingly important in the grain inventory process, leading to the establishment of specialized roles within the community dedicated to managing these transactions. Record-keeping methods. The evolution of record-keeping methods for grain storage inventory is a reflection of the increasing complexity of Viking society. Early practices relied heavily on oral traditions, with information about grain stores passed down through generations. However, as the importance of accurate inventory management became more pronounced, the need for written records emerged. The introduction of runic writing provided a means for Vikings to document their grain inventories more formally. Runestones and wooden tablets were often inscribed with details regarding grain types, quantities, and storage locations. These documents served not only as practical inventory records but also as legal contracts in trade agreements. The practice of inscribing runes on wooden sticks, often referred to as stick records, became a common method for grain inventory management. Moreover, the advent of parchment, introduced through contact with Christian monasteries, allowed for more durable and detailed record-keeping. Monastic scribes were adept at creating comprehensive ledgers that documented grain inventories, including notations on harvest yields, storage conditions, and even the names of laborers involved in the grain processing and storage. Such meticulous records were vital for maintaining accountability and transparency within the community. In conclusion, the history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a multifaceted narrative shaped by regional variations, evolving practices over time, bureaucratic regulations, supply chain logistics, and advancements in record-keeping methods. While the subject matter may appear mundane, the intricate details of these practices reveal the underlying complexities of Viking society, highlighting their adaptability and ingenuity in managing one of their most vital resources, grain. As we delve deeper into this historical narrative, we uncover not only the practices that sustained Viking communities but also the cultural and economic contexts that framed their existence in a world that was, at times, both bountiful and challenging. The tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a labyrinthine exploration that delves into the minutiae of agricultural practices, socioeconomic structures, and administrative regulations within the diverse regions inhabited by the Norse. By examining the regional variations and comparisons, the evolution over different time periods, bureaucratic regulations and laws, supply chain and logistics, as well as record-keeping methods, one can gain a comprehensive understanding of the complexities surrounding grain storage and its associated procedures. #Regional variations and comparisons. The Viking Age, spanning from approximately 793 to 1066 CE, witnessed a multitude of regional practices regarding grain storage inventory and shift rotation. The geographical diversity of the Norse settlements, from the windswept fjords of Norway to the fertile plains of England and the riverine landscapes of Eastern Europe, led to distinct methodologies adapted to local environmental conditions and available resources. For instance, in the coastal regions of Norway, where the climate was often harsh and agricultural yields uncertain, grain storage practices were heavily influenced by the necessity of maximizing the limited harvest. Here, the traditional stabber, a raised granary built on stilts, emerged as a critical storage solution. This design not only facilitated ventilation to prevent spoilage but also deterred rodents and other pests. The stabber was typically constructed from local timber, with a thatched roof and wooden slats that allowed for air circulation. Inventory procedures in these regions often involved meticulous counting and weighing of grain sacks, with records maintained by the local chieftain or designated grain overseer, known as the cornhopting. Conversely, in the more temperate regions of England, where agricultural practices were more established due to the Roman influence, grain storage systems were somewhat more sophisticated. The construction of granaries in these areas reflected a greater investment in permanent structures, often incorporating stone foundations and thatched roofs. The grain inventory procedures were less reliant on individual overseers and more on communal management systems, wherein local villages implemented a collective approach to grain storage. Comparatively, the English grain storage practices allowed for the establishment of more refined rotation schedules, as the abundance of grain necessitated a structured workforce to manage the inflow and outflow of stored produce. Furthermore, in the Eastern European territories, particularly in the region that is now modern-day Ukraine, Viking traders and settlers adapted their grain storage practices to align with local customs. The use of earth pits for grain storage was prevalent, as these pits offered excellent insulation against temperature fluctuations. The methods of inventory maintenance in this area were less formalized, often relying on oral traditions and communal knowledge rather than written records, reflecting the more nomadic lifestyle of these settlements. #evolution over different time periods. As the Viking Age progressed, the methods of grain storage and inventory management underwent significant transformations. Initially, grain storage was primarily a household endeavor, with families storing surplus grain in simple containers. However, as Viking society evolved and settlements grew larger, the need for more organized grain storage systems became apparent. By the late 9th century, with the establishment of trade routes and the growth of towns, the Viking economy began to shift from subsistence agriculture to a more market-oriented approach. This shift necessitated a re-evaluation of grain storage practices. The emergence of towns such as Ribe in Denmark and York in England created a demand for centralized grain storage facilities, leading to the construction of communal granaries. These granaries were designed to accommodate larger quantities of grain, and their inventory procedures became increasingly standardized. The 10th century saw further advancements, particularly with the advent of written records. The introduction of runic inscriptions on wooden tablets allowed for more precise tracking of grain inventories. This period also marked the development of more sophisticated shift rotation schedules, as labor became more organized and specialized. The establishment of guilds and the division of labor meant that individuals were assigned specific roles within the grain storage process, from harvesting to milling to distribution. By the 11th century, as Viking societies began to integrate with other cultures and kingdoms, grain storage practices continued to evolve. The influence of Christian monastic communities, which often managed vast agricultural estates, introduced new methods of record-keeping and inventory management. Monasteries implemented systematic accounting practices, utilizing ledgers and detailed logs to track grain stocks and labor contributions. This period also witnessed the codification of grain storage laws, which dictated proper practices and established penalties for negligence, thereby formalizing the previously informal processes. #Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic landscape surrounding grain storage during the Viking Age was complex and multifaceted. While the early Viking society was characterized by a relatively loose governance structure, the increasing complexity of grain storage operations necessitated the establishment of regulations to ensure the efficient management of resources. One notable development was the emergence of grain laws, which were enacted by local chieftains or kings to regulate the storage, sale, and distribution of grain. These laws often included stipulations regarding the construction of granaries, specifying dimensions, materials, and security measures to prevent theft or spoilage. For example, a law might dictate that granaries must be built at least 3 feet off the ground to inhibit rodent access, and that they must be constructed with a thatched roof to allow for ventilation. In addition to architectural regulations, the laws also encompassed inventory management procedures. Specific mandates required that grain must be weighed and recorded upon entering and exiting storage facilities, with penalties imposed for inaccurate reporting. The establishment of local councils, comprised of landowners and community leaders, facilitated the oversight of these regulations, ensuring compliance within the settlement. The codification of grain laws varied by region, reflecting local customs and societal structures. In some areas, such as the Danelaw in England, Viking settlers adopted existing Anglo-Saxon laws regarding grain storage, leading to a hybrid system that combined elements of both cultures. This adaptation underscored the fluid nature of Viking governance, which often absorbed and integrated local practices to create more effective administrative systems. ### Supply chain and logistics. The supply chain associated with Viking grain storage was intricately linked to the broader economic framework of Viking society. The logistics of grain supply involved numerous stages, including harvesting, transportation, storage, and distribution. Each stage required careful planning and coordination to ensure the successful management of resources. Harvesting was typically a communal activity, with villages organizing collective efforts to gather crops during the harvest season. Following the harvest, the grain would be transported to local granaries using wooden carts drawn by oxen or horses. The transportation process was often fraught with challenges, including inclement weather and rough terrain. Thus, it was critical for Viking settlements to establish reliable routes and schedules for transporting grain to minimize spoilage and ensure timely availability. Once at the granary, grain underwent a thorough inventory process. This typically involved the use of measuring tools, such as wooden scoops or stone weights, to precisely quantify the amount of grain being stored. The use of standardized measurements was crucial for maintaining consistency in inventory records, allowing for effective tracking of supplies. The distribution of grain was often managed through a network of local markets and trade routes. Settlements would establish regular market days, where surplus grain could be sold or exchanged for other goods. This process was facilitated by record-keeping methods that documented the quantities of grain available, the prices, and the parties involved in transactions. The emergence of trading posts along key routes further streamlined the logistics of grain distribution, fostering connections between different settlements and regions. Record-keeping methods. Record-keeping methods in Viking grain storage were essential for maintaining oversight of inventory and ensuring accountability within the system. Initially, records were maintained through oral traditions, with community leaders responsible for recalling the quantities of grain stored and the individuals who contributed to the harvest. However, As grain storage practices evolved, so too did the methods of documentation. By the mid-9th century, the use of runes became prevalent for record keeping. Wooden tablets were often inscribed with details regarding grain inventories, including the type of grain, the quantity, and the date of storage. This practice not only enhanced accuracy but also provided a tangible record that could be referenced in disputes over ownership or mismanagement. In addition to wooden tablets, the Viking Age also saw the utilization of ledger systems, particularly in areas influenced by monastic practices. These ledgers allowed for comprehensive tracking of grain stocks, labor contributions, and market transactions. Monasteries employed scribes who meticulously documented every aspect of grain management, creating a wealth of information that would be invaluable for future generations. The introduction of seals to authenticate records further demonstrated the importance of accountability in grain storage. Seals were often made from clay or wax, bearing unique marks that indicated the authority of the individual or institution responsible for the grain. This practice not only provided a means of verification but also deterred tampering or fraud within the grain supply chain. As Viking society transitioned into the medieval period, record-keeping continued to evolve, influenced by the burgeoning bureaucratic systems of emerging kingdoms. More formalized accounting practices, including double-entry bookkeeping, began to take root, paving the way for a more sophisticated approach to resource management. In conclusion, the tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a testament to the intricate interplay of regional variations, historical evolution, bureaucratic regulations, supply chain logistics, and record-keeping methods. Each aspect contributes to a broader understanding of how Viking societies managed their agricultural resources, reflecting the complexities of their economic and social structures. As one delves deeper into this captivating history, the mundane yet crucial details of grain storage become not only a reflection of the past but also a reminder of the foundational role that agriculture played in shaping Norse civilization. The intricate web of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is indeed a subject that invites a deep dive into the multifaceted aspects of daily life during the Viking Age. While the epic sagas and heroic tales of legendary figures such as Ragnar Lothbrok or Ivar the Boneless often overshadow the mundane yet critical operations of grain storage, it is vital to explore these procedures to appreciate the overall societal structure of the time. This narrative aims to elucidate the minutiae of these practices, drawing on minor historical figures, specific case studies, archaeological findings, and plausible primary source quotations to construct a comprehensive, albeit tedious, account. #minor historical figures and their roles. Focusing on lesser-known historical figures can shed light on the operational aspects of Viking grain storage. One such individual is Eirik Hardskeg, a lesser-known chieftain from the eastern settlement of Gerarshulmer, who played a pivotal role in the organization of agricultural practices in the late 9th century. Eirik's contributions to grain storage protocols are noted in the marginalia of the Viking chronicles, which, although often overlooked, provide insights into the administrative practices of the time. Eirik was renowned for his meticulous record-keeping, which was vital to the management of grain inventory. He implemented a system that utilized notched wooden sticks, referred to in the chronicles as SKR, to track grain quantities. Each notch represented a measure of barley or oats, and these sticks were stored in a communal granary. The importance of Eirik's innovations cannot be overstated, as they laid groundwork for more systematic approaches to inventory in subsequent Viking settlements. Another figure worth mentioning is Astrid the Grainkeeper, a woman who, according to local lore, ensured the smooth operation of grain storage in the village of Bjarg. Astrid was responsible for supervising the rotation of laborers tasked with maintaining the granaries. Her role was often dismissed in favor of male counterparts, yet her detailed accounts of grain spoilage and the seasonal shifts in labor demand provided invaluable knowledge that was passed down through generations. The saga of Bjarg, albeit a work of fiction, immortalizes her contributions, stating, "In the days of Astrid, no grain was lost, for she watched over it as the hawk watches the field." Specific case studies with dates. To better illustrate the operational dynamics of Viking grain storage, we can examine specific case studies from archaeological sites. One notable example is the excavation of the granary at Koppang, Norway, dated to approximately 800 CE. This site revealed sophisticated storage structures made from timber, with evidence of compartmentalized sections designed for different grain types. The granary's layout was meticulously organized, with sections labeled according to the grain type, which allowed for efficient inventory management. The Koppang granary was notable for its use of a double-door system that minimized exposure to pests and moisture. Archaeologists discovered remnants of barley and rye, which were likely stored in woven baskets made of reeds. Additionally, the presence of charred grain suggests that there were periodic checks where grain was burned to prevent infestation, a practice documented in the Viking Grain Management Codex, though the codex itself is an anachronism, reflecting later practices in earlier Viking society. Another significant case study is the grain storage procedures in the Orkney Islands during the 10th century, as uncovered in the excavation of the site known as Skarabrae. The granaries there were built into the ground, a design that provided natural insulation and humidity control. The inhabitants of Skarabrae had developed an inventory system that relied on the rotation of grain stocks, ensuring that older grain was used first, a practice referred to as FIFO, which stands for first in, first out. This method was essential for maintaining the quality of the grain, preventing spoilage, and ensuring the sustainability of resources. The meticulous records kept by the Orkney chieftains from this site indicate a strong reliance on seasonal labor rotation to manage both harvesting and storage. Comparative analysis with other regions. Viking grain storage practices can also be compared to those of contemporary societies, particularly in the British Isles and the Frankish Empire. The Carolingian Empire, for example, had developed an advanced system of grain storage that involved the use of large stone silos, which were often built into the side of hills. These silos allowed for the storage of significant quantities of grain, and their design included drainage systems to combat moisture, something that Viking granaries often lacked. In contrast, Viking granaries were predominantly wooden and more susceptible to the elements. However, The Viking emphasis on communal storage, where grain was kept in shared facilities, fostered a sense of community and mutual support, aligning with their societal values. In the Chronicles of Charlemagne, it is noted that the storage of grain was not merely a matter of sustenance but a reflection of power and order. This contrasts sharply with the Viking practice, where communal ownership was prioritized over individual wealth accumulation. Archaeological findings and interpretations. The archaeological record provides a wealth of information regarding Viking grain storage and inventory systems. Excavations at sites like Lons Meadows in Newfoundland have revealed evidence of grain storage that suggests the Vikings were not merely raiders but also engaged in agricultural practices even in distant lands. Here, archaeologists found remnants of grain storage pits, which were lined with stones to maintain a cool temperature. This aligns with findings from Scandinavia, where similar pit storage was common. The interpretation of these findings, however, is often complex. Some scholars argue that the presence of grain storage at Lons Meadows indicates a semi-permanent settlement, while others suggest it was merely a transient base for further exploration. The debate continues, with primary sources from later Viking sagas providing conflicting accounts of the settlement's purpose. Furthermore, the analysis of residues found in pottery and tools from Viking sites has led to insights into the types of grains stored and processed. The presence of barley and oats was confirmed through carbon dating of charred grains, and isotopic analysis suggests that these grains were not only used for food but also for brewing, indicating a cultural significance beyond mere sustenance. Primary source quotations, invented but plausible. In examining the historical documents of the time, it is crucial to consider the tone and content of the writings attributed to Viking chroniclers. A fictional yet plausible excerpt from the Viking Grain Management Codex might read, "As the sun rises over the fjords, we find that the grains of our forefathers rest in the cool embrace of timbered granaries. We must ensure our stock is well guarded, lest the hungry winds carry away our sustenance." A similarly invented quote from the Saga of Jarg could state, "It was in the year of our Lord 920 that Astrid, keeper of the grain, did declare, Let not the rot take our harvest, for we shall guard it as fiercely as we guard our kin." Such quotations, while fictitious, capture the spirit of the Viking commitment to their agricultural practices and the significance of grain storage in their society. Conclusion. In conclusion, the tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules reveals a complex and well-organized system that was essential for the sustenance of their communities. From the lesser-known figures like Eirik Hardskag and Astrid the Grainkeeper to the archaeological findings from sites like Koppang and Skara, each layer of detail contributes to our understanding of Viking agricultural practices. The comparative analysis with other regions highlights the unique aspects of Viking grain storage, while the invented primary source quotations serve to evoke the cultural significance of these practices. As we delve deeper into the minutiae of Viking life, we uncover a rich tapestry of organization, community, and resilience that extends far beyond the heroic tales of their legendary warriors. In this exhaustive examination, we have scratched the surface of a topic that, while seemingly mundane, is integral to understanding the fabric of Viking society. The practices surrounding grain storage and inventory management were not merely logistical concerns, they were woven into the very identity of the Viking people, reflecting their values, priorities, and communal spirit. The tedious history of Viking settlement, grain storage, inventory procedures, and shift rotation schedules. To embark on a comprehensive exploration of the Viking settlement, grain storage, inventory procedures, and shift rotation schedules, it is essential to start by acknowledging the intricate interplay of socio-economic factors that dictated the functionality and organization of these early medieval societies. The agrarian lifestyle of the Vikings necessitated an elaborate system of grain storage, inventory management, and workforce organization, which, while seemingly mundane, reveals the complexities of their daily lives. The context of Viking grain storage ***. Grain storage was not merely a practical necessity for the Vikings, it was a critical aspect of their agrarian strategy, particularly given the harsh climatic conditions of Scandinavia. The primary grains cultivated by the Vikings included barley, wheat, and rye, all of which were essential for sustenance and trade. The Vikings employed various methods of grain storage, such as pits, granaries, and even the use of wooden structures elevated off the ground to protect against moisture and pests. These storage solutions were not uniform across the Viking settlements, as regional variations in climate, soil quality, and available resources influenced the design and implementation of grain storage facilities. 2. The role of minor historical figures in grain management ***. While notable figures such as Eric the Red and Leif Erikson are often celebrated in Viking lore, the day-to-day operations of grain storage and inventory management were likely overseen by lesser-known individuals who played pivotal roles in the community. For instance, local chieftains and their appointed stewards would have been responsible for the organization of grain storage facilities. These stewards, often called fylkings, were tasked with maintaining the inventories, ensuring that there was sufficient grain for both the community's consumption and potential trade. A particularly illustrative example of a minor historical figure in this context is a steward named Gudbrand, who lived in a settlement near present-day Oslo around 900 CE. According to local records, Gudbrand was known for his meticulous record-keeping practices. He developed an early form of inventory management that involved the use of tally sticks, which were used to mark the amount of grain stored in various locations. His records indicated that on a particularly harsh winter in 902 CE, Gudbrand implemented a shift rotation schedule for the community members tasked with monitoring the grain storage to prevent spoilage and theft. This early form of inventory management not only ensured the survival of the settlement during tough times but also reflected the communal effort in grain monitoring. 3. Detailed case studies of grain storage practices ***. To fully appreciate the Viking approach to grain storage, one must examine specific case studies that illuminate their methods. One such case is the Viking settlement at Heathebu, located in present-day Germany. Archaeological excavations at Heathebu have revealed a series of granaries that date back to the 8th century. These granaries were constructed of wood and featured elevated floors, a design that was intended to protect the grain from dampness and rodents. In 830 CE, records show that the community of Hathabu experienced a bumper harvest of barley. The stewards of Hathabu implemented a systematic approach to grain storage, wherein they allocated specific granaries for different types of grain. The barley was stored in the northern granaries, characterized by their larger size and reinforced walls, while the smaller southern granaries were designated for wheat and rye. This strategic differentiation ensured that each grain type was stored under optimal conditions and minimized cross-contamination. Another significant case study can be drawn from the Orkney Islands, where a settlement known as Skara Brae was inhabited from around 3200 BCE to 2200 BCE, long before the Viking Age but later adapted to Viking practices. Excavations have uncovered well-preserved storage pits that were used to store grain. Scholars have noted that the layout of Skara Brae's grain storage pits illustrates an early understanding of inventory management, as the pits were organized in a manner that facilitated easy access and monitoring. 4. Comparative analysis with other regions ****. The Viking approach to grain storage can be compared with contemporary agrarian societies, such as those in Anglo-Saxon England and the Carolingian Empire. In Anglo-Saxon England, for instance, the corn barns served a similar purpose as Viking granaries, although the architectural designs differed significantly. The Anglo-Saxons often constructed their barns with thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls, while Viking granaries were more robust due to the harsher Scandinavian climate. Moreover, the Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne's reign, developed a sophisticated system of grain management that included written records and centralized storage facilities. Charlemagne implemented a tax system that required peasants to pay a portion of their harvests in grain, which was then stored in communal granaries overseen by local lords. This contrasts with the Viking model, which was more decentralized and community-oriented, relying heavily on local stewardship rather than overarching imperial control. Archaeological findings and interpretations. Archaeological findings related to Viking grain storage practices have been instrumental in shaping our understanding of their agrarian systems. Notable excavations at sites such as Jelling in Denmark and Ribe in southern Denmark have uncovered numerous artifacts related to grain storage, including grinding stones and remnants of storage pits. These excavations have provided insight into the types of grains that were cultivated and the methods of storage employed. In Jelling, for example, archaeologists discovered a large pit that contained charred grains, which were dated to the late 10th century. The presence of charred grains suggests that these were likely remnants of a failed storage attempt, possibly due to a fire or pest infestation. Such findings highlight the challenges faced by Viking communities in managing their grain supplies and underscore the importance of developing effective inventory procedures. In Ribe, a settlement that flourished in the 8th to 10th centuries, researchers unearthed a series of granaries with well-preserved wooden structures. The granaries featured ventilation holes and were constructed with overlapping timbers, showcasing the advanced building techniques employed by the Vikings. The artifacts found within these granaries, including measuring tools and storage containers, further illustrate the meticulous nature of their grain storage practices. 6. Shift rotation schedules and their implications ****. The implementation of shift rotation schedules among grain storage monitors was crucial for maintaining the quality and security of the grain supply. The Vikings, recognizing the importance of preventing spoilage and theft, likely developed a rotating system where members of the community would take turns overseeing the granaries. One could imagine a typical shift schedule as devised by Gudbrand, with each shift lasting from sunrise to sunset, allowing for a continuous watch over the grain stores. This system would involve a rotation of duties among families in the community, ensuring that no single family bore the burden of monitoring the grain supply for extended periods. Such a communal approach not only fostered a sense of shared responsibility but also allowed for the efficient management of grain inventories. Primary sources, though not historically documented, might have included hypothetical entries such as, "On the 10th day of the month of harvest, Gudbrand noted in the ledger that the barley stores were at an optimal level, thanks to the diligent watch of Egil and Fridius during their shift." Their keen eyes ensured no pests dared approach the precious grain. This fictional excerpt serves to illustrate the meticulous nature of record-keeping and the communal oversight that characterized Viking grain management. 7. Conclusion: the legacy of Viking grain storage practices ****. In conclusion, the grain storage practices of the Vikings reveal a complex and methodical approach to managing agricultural resources that was essential for the survival and prosperity of their communities. The interplay of minor historical figures, case studies, comparative analysis, archaeological findings, and hypothetical primary sources all contribute to a greater understanding of the significance of inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules in Viking society. While the topic may appear tedious and mundane at first glance, it is precisely in these details that we uncover the resilience and ingenuity of the Viking people. Their ability to adapt to their environment, manage resources, and organize labor ultimately laid the groundwork for their enduring legacy in history. Through the lens of grain storage, we can appreciate the intricacies of Viking life and the foundational role that agriculture played in shaping their culture and economy. Thus, as we ponder the vast and often overlooked history of Viking grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules, we are left with a profound respect for the diligence and organization that characterized this remarkable society. The Viking Age, spanning approximately from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was marked by remarkable exploration, trade, and settlement across Europe and beyond. While much of the romanticized narrative surrounding the Vikings focuses on their raiding and seafaring exploits, a more nuanced and laborious aspect of their society lay in the meticulous organization of grain storage and inventory procedures. As we delve into the tedious history of these practices, we will examine minor historical figures, case studies, comparative analyses, archaeological findings, and plausible primary source quotations to construct a detailed narrative that may indeed induce somnolence. ### Minor historical figures and their roles. While figures such as Ragnar Lothbrok and Leif Erikson often dominate the narrative surrounding Viking history, it is essential to illuminate the lesser-known individuals who played critical roles in the Viking agricultural economy, particularly in grain storage and inventory management. One such figure is Sigrid, a minor chieftainess from the region of Uppsala, who is noted in the annals of local lore as having implemented innovative grain storage techniques in the late 10th century. Sigrid was known for her meticulous attention to detail, a trait that served her well in managing the grain supplies for her settlement. Her methods included the construction of elevated granaries, which were designed to prevent moisture infiltration and pest infestation. In 986 AD, during a particularly rainy summer, Sigrid's granaries reportedly yielded a harvest that exceeded those of her neighbors, illustrating the effectiveness of her practices. Additionally, we must consider the role of the local inventory clerks. These individuals, often overlooked in historical accounts, were responsible for maintaining detailed records of grain stocks. One notable clerk, Eirik, recorded grain inventories in runestones, a practice that provided valuable insights into the seasonal fluctuations of grain supplies. His meticulous logs from 990 AD document not only quantities but also the quality of grain, with entries such as, "In the year of our Lord, the barley was bountiful, yet the oats were infested with weevils." Specific case studies with dates. The Viking settlement of Lons Meadows, located in Newfoundland, Canada, provides a fascinating case study pertaining to grain storage practices. While much of the focus in this area has been on the evidence of Norse habitation, excavations conducted between 1960 and 1978 uncovered remnants of storage structures believed to be used for grain. These structures, dating back to approximately 1000 AD, were constructed using local materials and featured ventilation systems intended to reduce humidity levels. Archaeological findings from Lons Meadows revealed that the Vikings cultivated a variety of grains, including barley and rye, which were essential for their sustenance during harsh winters. The careful placement of storage facilities, often situated on elevated ground, indicates a strategic approach to safeguarding grain reserves from flooding and other environmental hazards. The inventory procedures at this site can be inferred from the systematic arrangement of grain husks and storage vessels found during excavations, demonstrating an organized approach to inventory management. Another significant case study can be drawn from the settlement of Hedeby, located in present-day Germany. In the late 9th century, Hedeby served as a central trading hub for the Vikings. Records indicate that grain storage practices in Hedeby were particularly advanced, with large communal granaries that could accommodate surplus grain from neighboring farms. Archaeological digs in the 1950s unearthed evidence of these granaries, which featured thick walls and tightly sealed entrances designed to protect against rodents and moisture. The granary inventory system employed in Hedeby was characterized by a rotating shift schedule for workers responsible for monitoring grain stocks. This schedule, meticulously recorded in what has been termed the Hedeby Grain Ledger, detailed the daily responsibilities of workers, including the tasks of measuring grain, checking for spoilage, and reporting on inventory levels. For instance, an entry from June 12, 890 AD, states, "On this day, Bjorn and Ulf were assigned to measure the barley, and they noted a surplus of 15 bushels, yet the oats showed signs of mildew." Comparative analysis with other regions. When comparing Viking grain storage and inventory practices with those of contemporaneous cultures, it is evident that the Vikings exhibited both similarities and distinct differences. For instance, the Anglo-Saxons, who inhabited England during the same period, employed similar granary structures but placed a stronger emphasis on communal grain storage. Their records, notably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reflect a societal structure that relied heavily on shared grain supplies, particularly during times of famine. In contrast, Viking practices often lean towards individual ownership of grain stocks, which could lead to competition among neighboring settlements. This competition was evident in the frequent raids conducted by Vikings on Anglo-Saxon granaries, as recorded in the Chronican ex Chronicis, which details the sacking of a particularly prosperous granary in 851 AD. The chronicler notes, the Northmen, with their fierce countenance, descended upon the lowlands, taking great quantities of grain, leaving naught but empty silos in their wake. Additionally, the Byzantine Empire, with its advanced agricultural practices, provides a compelling comparative case. Byzantine granaries, often massive structures built within fortified cities, showcased intricate designs that included both storage and processing capabilities. The meticulous record-keeping in Byzantine grain inventories involved multiple layers of oversight, with clerks and overseers maintaining detailed logs of grain quality and quantity. This level of bureaucratic organization contrasts sharply with the more decentralized Viking approach, which, while efficient, lacked the comprehensive oversight seen in Byzantine practices. #Archaeological findings and interpretations. The archaeological landscape of Viking grain storage has yielded a wealth of findings that further elucidate the intricacies of their inventory procedures. Excavations at sites such as Koppang in Norway have uncovered remnants of wooden granaries dating back to the 9th century. These structures, often built on stilts, were strategically designed to prevent water damage and pest intrusion. Analysis of grain residues found within these granaries has revealed a diverse diet that included barley, oats, and even emmer wheat, which was likely imported from regions further south. Moreover, the grain storage techniques employed by the Vikings often incorporated local environmental conditions into their design. For example, the presence of specific types of clay used in the sealing of storage vessels suggests an understanding of moisture control that was ahead of its time. Archaeologist Dr. Ingrid Olsen notes, the use of local materials in granary construction illustrates a keen awareness of environmental factors that could affect grain preservation. Additionally, recent excavations at the site of Birka, a prominent Viking trading center in Sweden, have uncovered evidence of sophisticated inventory practices. Artifacts such as weights and measures used for grain distribution have been found alongside storage vessels, suggesting a system of trade that relied heavily on accurate inventory management. The careful calibration of weights indicates an advanced understanding of commerce, with Viking traders prioritizing the quality and quantity of their grain supplies. Primary source quotations, invented but plausible. To further enrich our understanding of Viking grain storage and inventory procedures, we can draw on plausible primary source quotations that might have been recorded during the period. These fictional yet believable quotes serve to illustrate the mindset and practices of Viking society. From the Chronicles of Uppsala, a fictional manuscript attributed to a cleric in the late 10th century, we find the following entry. In the year of our Lord, 989, I, Eirik, have borne witness to the great diligence exhibited by our folk in the management of our grain stores. The Honourable Sigrid, chieftainess of our land, hath decreed that all grains must be measured with precision, lest we be caught unprepared for the harsh winter ahead. Similarly, a fictional excerpt from the Hedeby Ledger provides insight into the daily labor of grain inventory management. On the 15th day of July, in the year 892, the lads of Hedeby did labor diligently. Bjorn remarked upon the state of the barley, saying, "It is plump and golden, fit for the feasting of our kin." Yet, we must not forget the oats, which have begun to show signs of decay. Let us take heed and rotate our stocks with care. ###Conclusion. In conclusion, the tedious history of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules is a multifaceted narrative that encompasses minor historical figures, specific case studies, comparative analyses, archaeological findings, and plausible primary source quotations. While the romanticized image of the Viking warrior often overshadows the more mundane aspects of their society, a closer examination reveals a population that was as adept at managing agricultural resources as they were at navigating the seas. The detailed inventory practices, the careful construction of granaries, and the diligent record-keeping of grain stocks illustrate a society deeply engaged in the challenges of sustenance and survival. As we reflect on the minutiae of Viking grain storage, we come to appreciate the complexities of their daily lives, which, while perhaps not as thrilling as their seafaring exploits, were nonetheless fundamental to the success and longevity of their settlements. As we draw this exhaustive examination to a close, it is with the hope that the diligence and tedium of Viking grain storage practices may lull the reader into a restful slumber, perhaps dreaming of elevated granaries and meticulously kept ledgers, where the whispers of Sigrid and Eirik harmonize with the soft rustling of barley in the breeze. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our gentle exploration into the intricate world of Viking settlement grain storage inventory procedures and shift rotation schedules. As we drifted through the annals of history, we uncovered the meticulous methods and the conscientious minds that ensured the survival of these resilient seafarers. From the careful counting of grains to the harmonious coordination of shifts, we painted a picture of a community dedicated to sustaining life in their rugged, beautiful landscapes. We began our journey by stepping back in time, imagining the vibrant settlements that dotted the Nordic coasts. We marveled at the ingenuity of the Vikings as they crafted systems to manage their resources, ensuring that each grain was accounted for and each worker was well rested. The rhythm of their lives, dictated by the seasons and the tides, mirrored the ebb and flow of nature itself. It was a dance of practicality and necessity, a testament to the human spirit's resilience and adaptability. As we traversed through the procedural intricacies of grain storage, it became clear that even the most mundane tasks were infused with purpose. The Vikings, with their unyielding commitment to community and survival, remind us of the importance of organization and cooperation in our own lives. We reflected on how these ancient practices have, in many ways, laid the groundwork for modern systems of inventory management and work schedules. Through the soothing cadence of our narrative, we hope to create a serene atmosphere, allowing your mind to wander and your thoughts to settle like the gentle waves upon a quiet shore. If at any moment you felt yourself drifting away, remember, dear listener, that you are welcome to replay this journey as many times as you wish. Each listen can provide yet another layer of comfort, inviting you to immerse yourself in the peaceful rhythms of history. As we close, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for joining me on this voyage through time. Your presence, your attention, and your willingness to engage with these stories are what make this experience truly special. May the echoes of Viking ingenuity and community spirit accompany you as you lay your head down to rest. Now, as the day draws to a close and the world outside quiets, I wish you a gentle transition into the land of dreams. May your sleep be deep and restorative, filled with the warmth of history and the promise of a new dawn. Good night, dear listeners, may your hearts be light and your dreams be sweet.